So can we think of a post-Walrasian economics for the weightless economy? Well, it's pretty obvious some of the basic ideas. Contracts have to be incomplete. We have to have social interactions, some of which are contractual and some of which are not. In this economy of the civics and the sharers, for example, social preferences make a big difference. I can refer back to Kenneth Arrow, who very early on, 1972, in a paper summarizing the fundamental theorem, strongly argued that when we have incomplete contracts or when we have missing markets, for example, in labor and credit markets, social norms, things like intrinsic preferences and so on, are essential to a well-performing economy. This model has shown you, but you also have seen many examples of what I call generalized increasing returns. It's not only a matter of technology. It could be on the supply side, it could be on the demand side, or it could be entirely social, as, for example, learning a language being something which is subjected to strategic complementarities. But it all has the same consequence, which is when you have increasing returns, in any of those senses, you have multiple equilibria. And therefore, you have the problem of dynamics. You have to think about why you might be at one equilibrium, why you might be at a good one or a bad one, or how you might make transitions. So all of a sudden now, because we have multiple equilibria, we're thinking we have to study the entire state space. We can't just study where the lines cross. First-year students know the answer is where the lines cross. Second-year students know that the answer is where the lines are tangent. But I want you to think none of that. I want you to look at the entire state space and ask for the vector field. I want you to think about where is the system going depending on the state that you're in. At the beginning I said I held out the possibility that the domain of economics might be shrinking. Is there anything left for economics to be about? Anything that we know of? Here I have Robert Fogel's estimates of the amount of time that we're going to spend at work. And as you can see, that's the red line here. This is 1880, is Fogel's estimates. In 1880, we spent the vast majority of our discretionary hours. Discretionary hours are 24 hours minus about 12, I think, or I guess it was 10 that he assumed. The red bar is hours of work, the green bar is leisure. This is, of course, a projection, 2040, but what it suggests is that in the not very distant future, we will spend a very small fraction of our time at work. Maybe we'll be spending something like 1/5 of the time, that is, our time at work will be 1/5 of the time that we spend at leisure. Now, of course, that's a problem for economics because we tend to think of economics as being like this. That's the economy there, and that's what it's all about. So when I mention the disappearance of work, I'm not talking about robots. That's another story. Maybe there's displacement of workers because of robots. I'm talking about the progress of humanity in liberating itself from working all the time, which is happening in the rich countries. It's happening, and it asks a question to us. Do we have a very good way of addressing problems of leisure, of caring for the old, caring for the young, leisure time activities, and so on? That's the disappearance of work. I've already mentioned the so-called zero marginal cost economy. So I put these in inverted commas because, of course, work is not disappearing. And of course, most of the economy is not zero marginal cost. It's still the production of clothing and food and all the necessities that people need, and which we will not escape from for a very long time. But there is a question about whether economics will remain or should remain the queen of the social sciences if it has a set of assumptions that requires it to focus on such things as the production of grain and steel when the economy and the society has really moved on to other things. So, as I say, the question then comes before us, is there anything left for the economy to be, for economics to be about? Well, I think there is a new economics for the new economy. I love economics, by the way, and I wouldn't be asking these provocative questions if I didn't think the answer is yes. Of course there is a lot for economics to be about, but it has to be about the things that matter and not about the things such as shopping, which are really a rather small part of our human existence. Social interactions have to be modeled as social interactions. Contracts are an example. Preferences, norms, outcomes, as I said. Now, I consider what happened since, say, the 1950s as somewhere in the 50s or 60s. It was maybe a little later, maybe it was when I was a doctoral student in the early 60s, economics took a wrong turn. We had a lot of good resources then. If you think of all the ideas today, which I call post-Walrasian, they were all around. Strategic interactions and the exercise of power, for example, Nash and Zuthen, von Neumann Morgenstern and so on, including evolutionary bargaining. That was there as part of actually Nash's dissertation. Non-market social interactions already highly developed by Herbert Simon in a paper of 1950 or Thomas Schelling, who then 40 years later gets the Nobel Prize. Or transactions clause, the exercise of power within the firm. You don't have to refer to Marx for that. You can go to Chicago and you can study Coase and you can find out a similar kind of exercise of power within a market setting. Alekin and Becker talked about evolutionary modeling. They talked about agents with limited cognitive capacities. They even talked about the zero intelligence kind of settings. Becker did in a paper in 1962. So all of these challenges which we've had to the cognitive assumptions and social preferences and so on. Duesenberry and Leibenstein talked about state-dependent preferences. Gunnar Myrdal talked about multiple equilibria in his lectures in Cairo. So now notice, these names are people who you've heard of. They had big positions at big universities. This was not some obscure assistant professor who had a good idea that was overlooked. These were the leaders of economics in the 50s and early 60s. And they were pushed aside. They were pushed aside by the rising mathematization of the Walrasian paradigm, which found it simple, or a bit simpler, to mathematize the Walrasian model than they would if they'd taken these great leaders of economics seriously. I don't know the answer, by the way. I think it's a big puzzle. At the time I was a student, we thought these were pretty good ideas. And then when I started teaching advanced micro, I turned out to be teaching a completely Walrasian course because I wasn't intelligent enough to pick up these ideas and put them in the course. Probably my colleagues wouldn't have allowed it. All right, let me close with this. Doing economics after the end of economics as we know it. I think we're going to do that. We're going to change, and I think economics will be the better for it. We're faced with a number of problems. One is that we have too many equilibria. There's something comfortable about having just one. If you have more than one, you have to have some theory of equilibrium selection. Which one is it going to be? And that has to be part of your theory. It can't be something you just add on in an ad hoc way. Why would one stationary state be more likely to be observed than another? Well, there are a number of ways we can do this, but probably we're unable to do it unless we refer to history and facts and evolution. So we need to narrow the range of uncertainty. Perfectly general theories are no longer going to be very insightful unless they're combined with history and other limitations which allow us to focus on a particular problem. Now, it's true, within the theory, there are some ways of narrowing the likelihood of one equilibrium over another, and I think they're very fruitful. There's some very nice developments now in stochastic Markov processes led by people like Peyton Young and others, and I think these are very much worth pursuing, but I think trying to solve the problem of equilibrium selection entirely within theory is probably going to be a mistake. The second is, because contracts are incomplete, economics is an arena of politics and culture. You see why? Because contracts are incomplete, the exercise of power by a principal over an agent is a critical part of how exchange takes place. And because that's true, the exercise of power means that politics is there in the workplace, there in the financial institutions and so on. So if we're going to be economists for a world in which we've seen the end of economics as we know it, we have to develop transdisciplinary skills. Or at least we have to learn how to build transdisciplinary teams, which include not only mathematicians and economists, but also people from biology, the other social sciences, history, and so on. The mathematics of this world that I'm describing are not simple. And I think we're going to have to be more modest in how we reason about the processes we're studying. I think in some cases we can benefit from simulations of many types, including agent-based models. And I think it's time for economics to give up its love affair with theorems. No other science is as in love with theorems as is economics. I use them, I think they're very, very useful, but most problems that I study are not susceptible to the kinds of analytical solutions that you get when you have theorems. So while theorems are a starting point, they cannot be the end of what we do, and they cannot define the problems which we're willing to ask. Now, economics, if economics is the great field of study that I think it is, it will address the problems that I mentioned: climate change, injustice, the spread of disease, and so on. It will do that. And if it does that, it will, of course, be a contested discipline. It will be a contested discipline, and that's good for us. The contest is good because we learn from it, but the discipline is also good because we learn from those with whom we disagree. And one of the things that I think is extraordinarily important today is to establish ways of this contest of ideas and exchange of demonstrations of the plausibility of arguments going throughout economics. Now, it can't be done by an association like this single-handedly. It takes an equal commitment from others who may have different perspectives. Everyone has to join in. But the objective is to join together in the process of trying to develop an economics that's worthy of being called a science. And that means engaging with others with whom one has rather fundamental disagreements. So the contest is good, but also the discipline is good. And the take-home message is, if we rise to this occasion, there is plenty for a new economics to be about. Thank you very much for this honor, and thank you for coming.